welcome back to biology. So last time we talked about the light reaction part of photosynthesis, the photo part. Today we're going to talk about the synthesis part, the Calvin cycle, the part where we actually make the sugar part of this. So if being a plant, plants kind of have it a little bit rough because they need all the same things that we need. They need carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, but they can't move around, right? They can't move around to consume these things. So that's why they do photosynthesis, is to turn the light reaction, to turn the light into a usable form of energy. Now, if you remember from the light reaction, we get ATP from it. So then why do then plants go through the trouble of then converting the ATP into glucose, or putting the energy then in glucose? The thing is that ATP isn't very stable, or it's not as stable as what glucose is. Glucose is a lot more stable. We can move it around the plant, we can store it for a long period of time, and then use it when we need it. So that's why we're making the glucose. It's actually kind of a long-term storage for our energy here. And we can also move it around the plant, which is good, because then we can move it back down into the root or up into the leaves, as that's how we get sap and to make maple syrup. So the light reaction gave us two things. It gave us ATP, which is the energy, the NADPH, which is our electron carrier, supplies the reducing power. So now we have energy and electrons to help us build stuff, to synthesize, to make a sugar. All right, so how is that helpful? It's helpful because now with those two things, with the ATP and with the NADPH, we can now fix carbon. So we can go through this carbon fixation process of turning CO2 into sugar, into the primary sugar, which is glucose that we use. So the NADPH is going to reduce the CO2. It's going to do that 6 times to give us sugar. So the process, we're not going to discuss the process in too much detail of what actually happens during the Calvin cycle, but in essence, CO2, it's fully oxidized, so that means CO2 has as little electrons as possible to get away with. So CO2 doesn't have very many electrons. Glucose does. Glucose is highly reduced, meaning it has as many electrons as it can possibly hold in the molecule. So to do that, to turn a oxidized product into a highly reduced product, is we have to really we're kind of pushing it uphill, which involves a lot of energy, and that's why we need the ATP and the NADPH. The ATP and the NADPH provide us with the energy to turn carbon dioxide into glucose. So this is what we see here. So the Calvin cycle is going to occur in the stroma, and then we need the ATP and the NADPH. So the ATP and the NADPH, they come from the light reaction. So the light reaction occurs right here in the thylakoid membrane, and then they're going to ship these two products out into the stroma of the chloroplast, where it's going to happen. The carbon dioxide enters the leaf via the stomata, kind of outside the leaf, enters via the stomata, and then it goes through this cycle of fixing the carbon using the ATP and the NADPH into glucose. Now we're saying glucose, but the reality is if you look at this picture here, we're saying that we get a sugar out of it, because one go around on the Calvin cycle does not give us, in essence, glucose. What one go around of the Calvin cycle gives us instead is what we refer to as G3P. Now, G3P, what it is it's a 3-carbon sugar. So really, the Calvin cycle makes G3P. One go around the Calvin cycle gives us G3P. But G3P is really an important process because it is a sugar, and it's an important intermediate molecule. Because then from G3P, plants can use it to quickly assemble glucose. If we stick 2 of them together, because G3P is 3 carbons, that's why we call it G3P. So if we stick 2 G3 two G3Ps together, we get glucose to store energy that way. We can use it to make lipids if we need to make a wax. The cuticle layer on plants is all wax to help drive that. To help make proteins and nucleic acids, it's there either as a source of carbon, because all of these molecules require carbon, or it's there as a source of energy in the form of glucose. So G3P is a very important intermediate form of the Calvin cycle, right? So one go around gives us G3P, which then we can use to make whatever molecule, further convention molecule that we need. So if we put it all together, right, what we got? Light reaction gives us ATP, NADPH. We consume H2O, and oxygen is released as a byproduct. The Calvin cycle, we consume CO2, produce G3P, which is the sugar, and then we regenerate the ADP and then NADP to go back to the light reaction. So if you just put it all together, here's, if we were just looking at the light reaction, talking about water plus light will give us ATP, NADPH, and oxygen right there. And oxygen is released as that waste product there. And then the ATP and the NADPH are going to move, and they're going to go to the Calvin cycle, where they're going to build the sugar. So then we say, and then that ATP and NADPH from the light reaction, plus some CO2, and we're going to get glucose out of it, out of the sugar building reaction. And then the ADP and the NADP that's used up here, just going to go back to the light reaction. So if we were to put the two equations together, we get something like this. So this is where that photosynthesis equation comes from. Carbon dioxide plus water plus some light is going to give us glucose and oxygen. And plants make both. So they make both energy and sugars from this process. Now, in terms of putting it all together with the cellular respiration, the equation's familiar because they evolved together. So the outputs of photosynthesis, the glucose and the oxygen, become the inputs for cellular respiration, right? And then the outputs, the carbon dioxide and the water, become the input for photosynthesis. Plants are really important in holding our atmosphere and our planet together because plants pull out truly staggering amounts of carbon dioxide from the air every year, right? They pull out, I think it's 120 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the air every year through photosynthesis. And the whole reason why our atmosphere is habitable enough to give us enough oxygen is because plants were doing photosynthesis, right? So they're related because plants will also then do cellular respiration too, right? Plants make the glucose to store it, but then how do they release the energy once it's stored? Well, then they run through cellular respiration, which is what we also do. So that's it for photosynthesis. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time. Bye.